Hey guys, welcome back to the hptuners live stream training. My name is Alex Peitz of Peitz Performance Tunes, and I'm going to be your instructor for today. Today we're going to be discussing speed density and all things that we can talk about related to speed density. Be sure to listen close because at the end of the class, we are going to be having a quiz. The person to answer the quiz correctly and the first person to answer that question correctly is going to win an MPVI2 with 2 credits loaded on it so you guys can get rock and rolling with your own device. So be sure to listen along, be attent, let us know if you have any questions. If you do think of some questions and you want to ask me offline afterwards, you can always contact us, contact me. Please let us know. Also, we are sitting in a 2012 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1, which we are going to be using to do some speed density practice on. I'm going to show you some VE tables on it. We're going to do some adjustments with it, just so you guys can kind of get a feel for how that process works. So that's going to be pretty awesome. We're going to do that towards the end of the class. We're going to not go too crazy with it, but we're just going to get a feel for the process so you guys can know how that works and kind of go from there. All right, so let's get into it. First and foremost, we want to discuss, what does speed density mean? Well, speed density is just a mode of operation. Your typical ECU or EFI system is going to have usually 2 different modes of operation, sometimes 3 depending on the application. One mode of operation is speed density. One mode of operation is mass airflow. You also could have a dynamic airflow, which would be essentially combining mass airflow and speed density, like the 2012 Camaro we're sitting in here right now. Thank you. Just got a little bit of energy to keep us rolling. So anyway, so the ZL1 actually uses speed density and mass airflow. So that's pretty cool. And so after a certain threshold, it will go to only mass airflow. We're going to discuss more of that later on. You also have alpha N, which is basically throttle and desired fuel based. That's a little older technology, I guess you could call it. It's a little more prevalent in motorcycles and some older EFI systems, but it is around there, out there still today. It does kind of have its own place. But speed density, what differs speed density from others, especially mass airflow, is the sensor that it's going to use in order to achieve the job. And that job of the mode of operation is to determine how much fuel to put into the engine. But before it can know how much fuel to put into the engine, it needs to know how much air is coming into the engine. And it's not physically measuring it, it's calculating it, and it being mass airflow. Because if you don't have a mass airflow sensor, you can still determine mass airflow, but you're just going to use a different way to get there to the same end result. So that is speed density. So it's going to use a MAP sensor, or manifold absolute pressure sensor, which is going to see pressure in the intake manifold. And so as pressure increases, typically the amount of cylinder fill is going to increase as well, which is also called cylinder air mass. So the more manifold pressure you see and lack of vacuum you see, the more airflow you have, and that also means you have more load and more torque depending on RPM and other variables such as that. Okay, so that's basically what speed density is. It's just the means to determine how much air is coming into the engine, so the engine's controller can know how much fuel to put into the engine. The amount of fuel that it puts into the engine is measured in milliseconds or microseconds, and that is called pulse width, right? So the longer the injector is open, the more fuel it's going to put into the engine, and also the longer or more pulse width you're going to see, and more milliseconds of pulse width you're going to see. So it's measured in time, right? So the amount of time that the injector is open. So again, the more airflow you see, the more the injector is going to be open. Now, that's how speed density works. However, with mass airflow is also determining how much fuel to put into the engine, or how long to keep the injectors open. But instead of measuring pressure or lack thereof, it's measuring airflow coming across the sensor in the intake tube. So instead of being placed in the manifold, it's in the intake tube. So it has what's basically a heated wire, and it sees airflow coming across it. So the more that wire is cooled off, or as that wire is cooled off, it fluctuates in how much, whether it's going to be voltage or it's going to be frequency. It's going to change that signal that it's outputting to the ECU based on how much that wire is cooled. And so that's going to help the ECU determine how much airflow is coming in, because you have what's called a mass airflow calibration table. And that table basically states at this frequency or at this voltage, we see X amount of airflow. And at this frequency or at this voltage, we see Y amount of airflow. So as airflow increases, typically your frequency will increase as well, but it can also go in reverse depending on what application you're talking about, such as a 2020 Denali truck. It uses a reverse scale. So kind of interesting there on that. But let's get back into it. Okay, map sensor considerations. The map sensor that you need for your application is going to vary greatly as to what modifications you have done to your vehicle, also what vehicle you have, and also if you're boosted or naturally aspirated. Pretty much the biggest time or the most important time where you're going to need to change your map sensor is when you add boost. Most of your vehicles come with a 1-bar map sensor, and that is basically for a naturally aspirated engine. Now, some vehicles don't come with map sensors at all, such as most of your late model Fords, until they started going back to EcoBoost or going to EcoBoost, where they went back to speed density, but that's for another time. Okay, so typically you're going to have a map sensor. If it's naturally aspirated, it's going to be a 1-bar map sensor. You may ask, what does bar mean? Well, that is a measurement of pressure. So you could have bar. Pressure can also be measured in PSI, which a lot of you guys may be more familiar with, and that's pounds per square inch. You also have kPa, which is kilopascals, right? So that's another unit of measure. Then you have torr and a couple other ones out there that you may never ever see, but they do exist. It gets more into more engineering units of measure, I guess you could call it that. All right, so when we're breathing atmosphere, that's 14.7 psi, right? Or 1 bar. Now, key on, engine off, depending on where you're located in the world, you should see 100 kPa if you're at sea level, or 1 bar or 14.7 psi. So to summarize that unit of measure, you have bar, which is 1 bar equals 14.7 psi, or if you're looking at kilopascals or kPa, that equals 100 kPa. So 100 kPa is 14.7, psi is 1 bar of map, right? So you could have, when you add boost, you are going to see above barometric pressure, right? You're going to see above what we're breathing, right? Key on, engine off. So anything above that is going to be boost. So you are now pressurizing the intake manifold and you're pressurizing the cylinder, and you're going to see above 100% cylinder fill, or 100% of that cylinder's potential to hold air. It's going to be above and beyond that. So that's awesome, because the more oxygen we can pack into our cylinder, as you guys know, the more power we can make, but also the more fuel you require, i.e. you're going to have higher mass airflow, which is either, again, measured by that mass airflow sensor, or it's measured in or by the map, which is looking at pressure, lack thereof, which would be vacuum, or pressure above ambient, which is going to be boost. So just keep that in mind. So if you're going to make 14.7 psi of boost, or 14.7 psi gauge pressure, or that would be essentially 29 psi, 28, 29 psi of absolute pressure. A map sensor is manifold absolute pressure. So that map sensor reading is not only going to see baro, right? It's going to see above that. So that's your absolute, right? So if you want to know your gauge pressure, you're going to have to subtract baro from that, right? So if you're at 100 kPa, key on, engine off, right? But now you have 14.7 psi of boost, which is 100 kPa of boost, your map sensor will read 200 kPa, and that would require a 2-bar map sensor to work correctly. So if you guys are going to make 14 pounds of boost, you need to get a 2-bar map sensor, in a shorter way of saying all of that, right? But I just wanted to describe those differences to you and hopefully give you a little bit of better idea of how that works. Now, if you're going to Colorado, for example, key on, engine off is not going to read 100 kPa. At about 5,500 foot elevation, Littleton, Colorado specifically, because I just tuned some cars there before, it's about 83 kPa, key on, engine off. So you have to remember that you're subtracting that, and then anything above 83 kPa is now boost, right? So it gets a little hairy, a little confusing, depending on how you look at it, right? But that's why we also have pressure ratio, which you'll see in this ZL1, you'll see pressure ratio as well, versus just measuring manifold pressure for the VE table. Again, we'll get into that later, but just things to keep in mind, right? So if we are making 200 kPa in Colorado of manifold absolute pressure at wide open throttle, that's actually over 14 pounds of boost. So it's going to be over 14 psi of gauge pressure. It's going to be closer to like 16, 17 pounds of boost, because you have to remember we are in a different atmosphere, right? Or not atmosphere, but we have different barometric pressure depending on where we go. So there's changes that are happening there. So map sensor considerations, we talked about that quite a bit. What map sensor is right for your car? Well, it depends on what you're doing, again, like we discussed, but typically it's going to vary with how much boost you're going to run. Different ways to activate speed density on your car. All right, so now you've got the right map sensor. Of course, you would need to get different injectors if you're going to be boosting the car, so on and so forth, right? So typically, let's fast forward, let's say we're going to get into the tuning process. At that point, you need to know how to put your car into speed density. I prefer to tune the car in speed density first in a GM platform specifically, and then I'll tune mass airflow, and then I'll blend it. Some guys tune MAF first or calibrate the MAF first, and then they go speed density, and then they blend it. Doesn't really matter. It's just your personal preference and how you want to do that. What does matter is that it's correct, because if we don't do speed density tuning on these cars, let's say your mass airflow sensor fails. Well, you need to have a backup, and that backup is going to be that map sensor, and that backup mode of operation is going to be speed density. And so speed density is not going to work if you have not tuned the VE table or calibrated the VE table properly. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's always a good idea to start with speed density. Now, how do you get there? Well, I'm going to open up a 2002 Camaro file just because it's easy to reference everything, and we're going to go from there. So let's open that guy up. So follow me to the screen now. All right, so we have the VCM editor open. We're going to go to File. We're going to go to Open. For you guys that are following along at home, we're going to go to Documents, hptuners, and we're going to go to Logs and Tunes, Samples, and here's our 2002 Chevrolet Camaro P01 or P01 controller. All right, so that's opened up pretty quick. All right, so let's activate speed density on this bad boy. All right, so let's go to Engine, let's go to Airflow, and let's go to Dynamic. So under Engine, Airflow, Dynamic, we're going to see some different variables here, or some different scalars mostly we're working with on this table, or excuse me, on this page. So we're going to find our high RPM disable value. Basically, what the high RPM disable value is essentially a RPM value in which above that, it's only going to read off mass airflow. So it's going to disregard anything it sees from the map sensor at that point, essentially. So we don't want it to read off the mass airflow sensor. We only want it to read off the map sensor. So because of that, we need to move that value way up. So I'm going to put that at about 8,000 RPM. Because while I would love to see 8,000 RPM, we're probably not going to see that on this car. So just wait. I've got some stuff for that coming. All right, so 8,000 RPM here. Now let's go to Engine Diagnostics. Let's go to Airflow. And you are going to see mass airflow frequency fail high. This value indicates at this frequency or higher, we have a failed mass airflow sensor. And so the ECU is going to say, wait a second, our mass airflow sensor is not working correctly. What do we do? Well, we default to speed density. So in order to make the car think the mass airflow sensor has failed, we're going to put our mass airflow frequency to, some of you guys may have guessed it, 0 hertz. So 0 hertz and above, the ECU is going to think, mass airflow sensor is not working correctly. Well, we better use speed density. And that's what it's going to do. you're not quite done yet. All right, you're not quite out of the woods. So we're going to go to Engine Diagnostics again and go to DTC. Now you're going to see P0101 through P0103. All three of these mass airflow codes are needed to be emitted, or not emitted, to be shown to the ECU before the ECU says, okay, we're going to go to speed density. Currently, from the factory, it says mil on second error. Mil is short for malfunction indicator lamp. So we want it to throw the mil on first error. So you just click right here on the drop down, go to mil on first error. PO102, mil on first error. PO103, mil on first error. So now that should really, for sure, get this car into speed density. Now, on later GMs, such as this 2012 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1 we were sitting in, it works exactly the same way. So you can force it into speed density by following the same procedure. Pretty straightforward. You know, once you've done it a couple times, you guys can watch this video again later in case you weren't able to write it down, and you can definitely get going on that. All right, so we have activated speed density, and at this point we would flash the car and we would go into doing our VE tuning. We're not going to be doing that yet. This is just for an example. All right. So how do we ensure that our vehicle is running in speed density? Well, essentially all you really need to do is start the car and make sure, go to your DTC icon. So let's go to the scanner real quick, or the VCM scanner. Let's close this guy. And you would go to your diagnostics and info after you connect to the vehicle. Click connect to the vehicle, go to diagnostics and info, and then you're going to go to the DTC and you're going to read DTC. I can't do that right now because I'm not actually connected, but we can go ahead and do that just to show you how that works. All right, so we're going to go key on, and this is the 2002 Camaro, but the process is the same. All right, so it's gathering vehicle information. All right, so now we're connected. You can see 2012 Camaro, awesome. Now we're going to click on diagnostics and info, and now we're going to click on read DTCs. All right, so you're going to see a lot of other body control module codes sometimes. We just had a bunch of stuff apart on this car, so don't worry about that. But what you do need to worry about is if it's throwing a code. Now, actually, it already forced this car into speed density before the class started. So you can see it's already throwing the P0102. That means this car is in speed density mode. No mass airflow for us today. All right, so that's pretty cool. There are some other codes. And just so you guys, in case you're wondering, the only codes that we're really focused on are ones that are pending or current codes. If it says permanent or history, that just means that it was there at one point and it needs to go through quote unquote a self-healing process. So after X amount of key cycles on and off, those permanent codes will eventually fall off, but they're not causing a mill light or a mill, which if you guys remember, it's a malfunction indicator lamp. They're not causing the mill. What's causing the mill are the current or pending codes. That's one of my #1 questions I get from a lot of people. So hopefully that will debunk some of that, guys. Some of that, not myth, but help clear that up for you guys back home. All right. So we're going to disconnect from vehicle. We're going to shut the key off. I'm going to put that there for now so we don't get dinged at. Now the lights are on. Shut those guys off. Where are that? There you go. All right. So that's how we ensure that our vehicle is running in speed density. So for you guys at home who may have trucks, some of the trucks, I just want to side note here. Sometimes if you try to force your Silverado, like, I don't know, 04 to 2010-ish Silverados into speed density, they will not go into speed density right away because they actually have some additional values which they wait for. It's not shown in here, but if you go back to engine diagnostics and airflow, which actually in the Camaro, it would have that. This is the Camaro file. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. Just want to show you guys this because I know a lot of you guys probably have trucks. So engine diagnostics and airflow, and you're going to see this high count threshold. You're going to put that to 0. That will absolutely force it into speed density. Otherwise, you're going to have issues, all right? Because it's going to try to think about, okay, am I speed density or am I math? It's not going to know. It's not going to know what to do. So just put those values to 0, both of these 400s, and you'll be good to go. Another thing to note on these cars, if you go to P0101, P0102, P0103, you you don't want to show no error reported, because I know you might want to do that. If you click on no error reported and you force it into speed density, following the steps that I outlined a few minutes ago, the car will not run. So just be sure, do not select no error reported. Select mill on first error. That's extremely important, or else you will not have the desired result that you're looking for. All right. So, we've ensured that our cars run in speed density. Now let's talk about virtual VE versus traditional VE. This is pretty interesting, guys. I'm not going to woo you with some magical calculation or formula. I can tell you that I have worked on trying to come up with a formula to convert GM VE to traditional VE or vice versa. Just side notes here, but it's gotten very close, but I don't have that specific equation for you. But at the end of the day, you really don't need to know that. I'm going to tell you everything you pretty much need to know to be able to tune the car and get it to work correctly. First and foremost, make sure you have the correct injector data. Characterize your injectors properly. I cannot stress that enough. If you don't characterize your injectors properly, or tell the ECU what size injector it has, what fuel pressure you're running them at, and what the flow is at that pressure, everything else is going to be thrown off in the entire tune. So that's extremely important, because if that's correct, then our airflow model is going to be correct. If our airflow model is correct, our torque model is correct, and then everything else is happy, especially if you're in an automatic transmission vehicle, gearbox, whatever you want to call it, if it's DCT, so on and so forth. If the torque calculation is correct, the gearbox or transmission is going to know, okay, I need to apply this much pressure and I need to cut this much timing to manage our torque in between the shifts to sustain the life of the transmission or the gearbox. So keep that in mind. What's that? Yeah, so if you guys want to see how that looks, where you're going to input that injector data is going to be under engine, under fuel, in general. You have your injector characterization right here. So, for example, injector flow rate versus KPA. This is back to the 2002 Camaro, just so you know. All right. So here's manifold vacuum. Here's injector flow rate. So key on engine off, we have no manifold vacuum present, and we should have 58 psi of fuel pressure or 400 kPa of fuel pressure. But this is not measuring fuel pressure or differential pressure like the Camaro would or the ZL1 would. This is measuring manifold vacuum, right? So at zero manifold vacuum, we have a 28 pound an hour injector, right? You can also change that pounds per minute, pounds per second, kilograms per second, kilograms per minute, so on and so forth. Grams per second. So a lot of different ways to view that. But pounds per hour is typically how most people view the injector, or CCs as well. But so yeah, 28.7 pounds per hour. So if you get a 100-pound an hour injector, let's just say, you need to update that table. If you don't, your VE table is going to be completely off. So this is number one important, most important thing. If you screw up everything else on a tune, it won't matter so much if you get the correct injector characterization. So please, please, please characterize your injectors properly. All right. So go back to airflow now, and let's look at the VE table. All right, so we have our VE table. Again, this is from a 2002 Chevy Camaro. So this is what we call traditional, or what I call traditional VE, right? So we have engine speed on our x-axis. On our y-axis, we have manifold absolute pressure. And look at that. There's our favorite unit of measure, kPa. So 100 kPa, again, is typically what we're going to see if we're at sea level. And 100 kPa, again, equals 14.7 psi, or 1 bar, or 762 torr, I think. In case you guys wondered about torr and what that unit measure was, just from tuning Vipers back in the day. So it just stuck in my head. So sorry about that. But all right, so manifold pressure and engine speed. Those are our axis values. Inside here in the Z values, if you will, we have cylinder fill or volumetric efficiency, right? So the efficiency of our cylinder. Now, if we're at 100% efficiency, that cylinder is filled with as much absolute air as it can hold. Now, if we have boost, it's going to go above 100% efficiency. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. But this is what that table looks like. So we see 99%. That is going to be also where we're going to see peak torque from the engine, right? Anything beyond that, torque is going to start to fall off, but horsepower will still go up because we have momentum, we have engine speed to help us make that power, even though our torque is falling off. We've talked about this in the past for you guys who have listened in previous episodes. Please feel free to go back to that to refresh on that. But let's move on. That is a traditional VE table. Now I will show you the virtual VE table, which is in the 2012 Camaro, which we are also sitting in right now. So let's go to engine, let's go to airflow, and you'll notice we don't have a VE table. We have what's called VE coefficients. These coefficients basically are going to go into a calculation to determine the amount of cylinder fill or efficiency we have, to then in turn determine the amount of mass airflow we have, which then the ECU uses that information to command an injection pulse width value, which again is measured in milliseconds or microseconds typically is what we're going to see. So these coefficients are just another means to do this. Now, why did they go away from a traditional VE table? Well, one of those reasons could be computing power, right? Because we need to dedicate more memory or random access memory to other values which need to be had, or calculations which need to be made in order for the engines to run more efficiently, you know, because obviously as time goes on, engines get more complex, algorithms get more complex, all these measures which we need to take to make sure the engine runs efficiently as possible and emissions are extremely good, that takes a lot. So this is a more efficient way to determine the amount of airflow, and it's just better on the ECU. It doesn't have to work so hard for this specific task, at least. All right, so how do we adjust this, you ask? Well, like, what are we visually going to use to tell the engine how much efficiency we have? Well, you have the virtual VE generator. I have also discussed this in previous classes as well, but again, we will go to edit, we'll go to virtual volumetric efficiency. All right, so we have our VE table pulled up here. This is a visual representation of all the coefficients. If we make an adjustment here, it directly affects those coefficients, which directly affects how much efficiency the engine's computer is computing or calculating. All right, so we have different VE tables for different VE modes, for manifold switch closed, manifold switch DOD, or manifold switch closed DOD, manifold switch open DOD, and manifold switch open. So depending on your car, now we don't have IMRC on this car, so that's not even a thing that we have to worry about, but it was there, okay? So depending on that, and also depending on cam angle, we'll change our VE with that, right? In this particular car, we have a fixed cam position, so we don't have VVT, so we really don't need to worry about that specifically. But if you have a VVT car, you can change your cam angle and change your VE per cam angle. Kind of cool, right? So once you adjust that, you'll go back here and you'll see the coefficients are going to change. They'll save, flash, and then you will try it again, right? Now, go back here real quick. Let's see here. What's our scale? Right now, this is scaled to 105 kPa. Well, as I discussed earlier, that is only going to be good for one bar or for a naturally aspirated application. So we need to see above that. So we need to click right here on manifold absolute pressure, and we can go to our default scales, and we can change from 105 to 210 to 315. This particular car, we're not making over 14 pounds of boost, so we're going to use the 205 or 210 scale. Right? Make sure I did that correctly. 210. Okay. All right, so now we're up to 210 kPa. Now, sometimes you get anomalies such as we're seeing right here, and you have to just get that out of it for now. And basically, the only way we're going to be able to do that is go from 1600 RPM, left click drag over to 2600 RPM or 26, yep, and then interpolate between horizontal bounds. That can actually get rid of that, but now we have a problem because it's too low. Well, we just need to increase these values back by clicking here, going over to 3,400 RPM and down. We're going to interpolate again. Okay, so you see what I did there. So that smoothed that out. We still have a nice little dip here. So just for quick reference, so you guys know how to do that, then you would interpolate between vertical bounds. So I'll undo real quick. It's just how the calculations are working. So one person asked what causes this to happen. Because we changed the scale, and so it's just essentially saying, okay, you changed the scale, and it's the calculation is just off a little bit, and so we're going to correct that, and we're going to generate our new coefficients after we click calculate coefficients, and that'll correct it, and then we can go on from there. But yeah, just when you're messing with the scale, sometimes things get off and you have to correct it, and that's what we're doing here. All right, so again, we interpolated between vertical bounds, and now we should be better off. That looks more like a VE table should, right? All right, so I'm also right-clicking and dragging, just so in case you were wondering. So we're gonna get back to this though. We're not gonna save this. No. And we'll do it again just so you guys, in case you forget. So that is the differences between a traditional and a virtual VE table. So one's a virtual, literally a virtual representation of the VE, and one's a physical representation, and one uses GMVE and one uses your traditional VE, which is in percentages. I'm sorry, I need to go back to that real quick. So just to show you guys, you may have wondered, hey, we've got 4-digit numbers instead of 2-digit numbers here. Well, that's because it's GM's new way. Back then, it was their new way of determining how much efficiency is in the engine. Now, the 4-digit value basically is accommodating or determining, okay, it's just accounting for differences or variances in humidity, in pressure, and other variables. So it's accounting for that in its own way, and so it can give you this 4-digit number, basically, right? So how that whole calculation works, I can't tell you that. I don't have access to that specific information. Again, I did try to backwards calculate or determine, take a VE value from one car, which had been like a P59 controller, I believe, and it was a LS2, so it was a shared LS2 from a P59, and then they went to a newer controller, an E40, I believe, which would have been a GTO. So the GTO may have been a trade-off there. I can't remember exactly what I did, but I took that VE number and then I used some of the calculations which I found online, and then I determined, okay, spit out a 4-digit number or 4-digit to 2-digit, and it's very, very close, but I don't want to give you that and then it not be the exact way in which you would really want to see it. So just so you guys know, that's the difference, but it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. So somebody asked, will service engine soon light always be on while in speed density mode on a 2002 Camaro? The service engine soon, you can actually, if you have your car in speed density mode all the time, let's say you remove the map, you can disable the service engine soon light by just unchecking service engine soon, but still you would want your DTC to show mill on first error, but you can uncheck the SES or service engine soon and you'll be good to go. You're not gonna have a light on the dash, but it will still be in speed density. It's just when you go plug into the car and you read DTCs, you will see P0102 typically or P0103 pop up, but it's not going to cause a light on the dash. But it could cause you issues with passing at your local emissions place if you have a check engine light on or a mill on. So just keep that in mind. So that's really for off-road purposes only. Like if you have a car that's a race car, it doesn't matter, right? But that's just FYI on that. Okay, so again, whether it's 4-digit, whether it's traditional or virtual VE, you're going to tune it exactly the same way. It's just the unit of measure is going to be different. Okay, so when we go dive into this Camaro, you'll see it works the same way as if you're tuning a traditional VE table. So just keep that in mind. Don't worry about the 4 digits. Don't let it scare you. It's just GMVE, and the purpose of the class is not to cover that. It's to cover the speed density mode and how that works. And that's exactly what we're doing. So, all right, moving on here. All right, resolution on VE tables. we've actually kind of already covered this, but I directly did that by clicking right here. When I clicked right here on manifold absolute pressure, left click, I changed my resolution. I increased it, right? I didn't lose any resolution by going to 2-bar. Now, on some applications, like a P59 controller on like a truck, like an 03 Silverado, for example, if you do a 2-bar custom OS, you select that, your VE table is not going to double in size. You saw how ours doubled in size. In that particular application, that's not going to happen. So you will lose some resolution. You'll have half the resolution that you had before, because instead of going from 10 kPa to 105 kPa, in 5 kPa increments, it may go from 10 kPa to 210 kPa in 10 kPa increments. A lot of kPas in there, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. Also, we can show you on the traditional VE table. Now, what's really awesome is if we add a custom OS to this O2 Camaro, we're not going to lose any resolution because the controller will let us. So if we want to do that, we're going to click on OS, and we're going to go to speed density 2-bar, real-time tuning, RTT, that's what that stands for. So apply code modification. All right, so now in order to do this, we need to save the file with new name, close the current file, open a new file, and use the write entire process only on the first write. So, all right, file, save as. I usually call it 2-bar working. We already have that, but that's okay. Yes. Okay, we're going to close this, or just go to open, really. All right, now we're going to go back to our VE table. And now it's all a fixed value of 519%. That's a lot of boost. That's like 5-bar, which that would be pretty crazy. But it wouldn't be the whole table, and it wouldn't be flat like that. That's just a default number that it spits out, and then you have to go from there and make it work. Now you may be asking, well, how do I do that? Like, I don't have anything to start with. Well, I'm going to show you how to get that done. So what we can do is open up a new instance of VCM Editor. Maybe. You can't compare, because now if we try to compare the original 2002 Camaro file, that will be grayed out because they won't match. So we have to go open a separate file. All right, so we have a 2002 Camaro, which we want to open up. Just go to Documents, hptuners, logs and tunes, samples, 2002 Chevrolet Camaro. We go back to our traditional VE table. All right, so this is really pretty simple. We're just going to highlight the whole thing, Control C or right-click copy. And we can close that guy. And we're going to paste into our new VE table, which is our 2-bar custom OS. Now we have, excuse me, we have that traditional VE table, and now we're close, but that was only half of the table. So what do we do from that point? Well, it's pretty simple. You're just going to left click on this bottom row, which is 105 kPa. Then you're going to copy that. You're going to go to the bottom row, or 210 kPa, and we're going to paste, right? Now, that's not it. We need to go back up here into our calculation box, and let's say we're going to increase it by 60%. So multiply by 1.6. All right. And now we're going to left click on the 100 kPa row, drag down, and now we're going to interpolate between vertical bounds. And now we have a roughed in, if you will, VE table. And it's going to cover us up to 2 bar of absolute pressure, or 1 bar of boost, or 14.7 psi of gauge pressure or boost. So okay, guys, so let's show you here. Compare, open compare file, and we go here. It does not work because we have different resolution in this table versus the original table. So it's grayed out. So that's why I opened a different instance of hptuners or VCM editor. So in case you guys are wondering. All right, so now we've got our VE table set up initially, and we can go from there. I mean, it's going to be somewhat close. Let's say you just added, Pro Charger, for example, to this O2 Camaro. You didn't add a cam, didn't add heads or anything like that, so we really didn't change the efficiency of the engine at idle and part throttle. So it should start up and run with this map in here. But now, obviously, you're going to have boost. So this is just a shot in the dark. It's actually going to be pretty close. You guys would be surprised. And if you want to clean it up a little bit, you could, interpolate between vertical bounds, kind of smooth that little hump we're seeing here. We're going to make that a little bit easier to transition, right? So that's kind of how that works. That also covers, when you add boost, how to set up your VE table initially. Now, one thing we haven't discussed is how to put that into the scanner. So we need to copy these X and Y axis values and put them into the scanner and make sure that's working correctly. Excuse me. All right, so to do that, we just want to right click, column axes, copy labels. There we go. Getting a little crazy up in here. All right. So now we have the VCM scanner open. I want to replicate my VE table in the VCM scanner. So we're going to select right in this area, in the graph area, right click, graph layout, and we're going to make a new graph, add table. And we're going to call this LTFT plus STFT. All right. 2 decimal places. Say 4 cell hits required. High value 25 or 25%. Low value of negative 25. And red for lean. Green for rich. Column axis, that's what we just copied out of our VCM editor, VE table. So now we're going to Control V, paste that in there. All right, and then we're going to use engine speed for our parameter. All right, now go back to the VCM editor, right click, row axis, copy labels. Row axis is right here, Control V. And manifold absolute pressure. All right, so note that our unit of measure is wrong. It is not in PSI, we're measuring KPA. So make sure your unit of measure is correct. And now you have replicated your VE table in the scanner. And we've done this before in other classes, but in case you didn't see it, that's how you do it. And now you can go collect your data, your trims, or if you force in an open loop, you would do your air fuel ratio error or EQ ratio error, depending if you're using Lambda or if you're using AFR. Doesn't really matter. Same difference in terms of how the mechanics of it work. So pretty cool, guys. Now, talked a lot about that, and let's kind of move on. Let me set this back up. Awesome. I appreciate all you guys listening in. Thank you so much. By the way, thank you. We couldn't be possible without you guys. All right. So what do you need to do when you add boost? We just discussed that. All right. Setting up the scanner for speed density. That's basically what we have done so far. So again, we are measuring long-term fuel trim plus short-term fuel trim versus engine speed versus manifold absolute pressure. So that's basically how we're going to determine if our VE table is correct or it's not correct. So let's say we did a log, and we're going to do a log here in a second, but if we saw negative 20% and then the whole table, we know that our VE table is 20% off and it's 20% too rich. So it thinks that the cylinder is filled with 20% more fill than what it actually is. So it calculated 20% too much mass airflow and i.e. gave you 20% too much injection pulse width. So when we go back, we need to adjust our VE table by 20%. So to reduce our VE values by 20%, we need to multiply them by 0.8. So that will reduce them by that much. So just to show you guys how that would work, and we're just speaking in, just hypothetical here. So we're going to highlight the entire table, multiply by 0.8. That would lower every single value by 20%. And theoretically, if we were exactly 20% off everywhere, we could flash this to the car and our VE would be perfect, right? That would be perfect. That would be in an ideal world, which we don't live in an ideal world. So there's always going to be some give and take here, some compromise, if you will. So just keep that in mind. But we do the best we can. All right. And again, that comes down to injector characterization. Making sure you have the correct injector data is going to make this VE tuning process a lot easier and a lot more correct and precise, right? So just keep that in mind. All right, so we set up a scanner, and we've talked about volumetric efficiency and cylinder air mass a lot, but to go back and just kind of hit on this point one more time. So let's see here. Where do we have 100% VE? Well, we've just reduced everything by 20%, so it's not really accurate. So let's go open up our original O2 Camaro file. All right, so we have 99% VE at 105 kPa and 4,400 RPM. That is also our peak torque. That's where you would see peak torque on the dyno graph if you're on the dyno. So that is basically 1 gram per cylinder, right? Per cycle. So anyways, so that is the equivalent of 1 gram. So if you go to the spark table and we look at our spark, high octane, we have 1 gram cylinder air mass and 4,400 RPM would command 19 degrees of timing, right? So when you see cylinder air mass and you see 1.0, think of that as 100% cylinder fill. If you saw 1.5 grams, that would be 150% cylinder fill, right? So kind of interesting how that works, but it's kind of cool, right? So just bear in mind that type of relationship there. Excuse me one second. All right, we got another question coming in. How do you change the scanner layout from the non-tab view to tab view without reloading defaults? The scanner layout for tab view. So you mean basically what I think you're saying is to get rid of this tab and this tab without changing defaults. That's a pretty good question. No, all good. You could just X out of graph, X out of gauges, X out of chart versus time, and you could literally just see only these guys. But you could also just move it all the way over here so you really can't see anything else if you just want to look at raw data. So just, the way that you want to see the scanner is going to vary with who you are and what's aesthetically pleasing to you, I suppose. But if you just want to look at raw data, you can certainly do that, and you're not going to change your default around if you do it like this. Or you can X these out, but then you'd have to reload your layout back in afterward. So that may be a little more cumbersome for you. I hope that helps answer your question. I don't quite understand what you mean by tab view, but I think you mean the tabs for graph and gauges and chart versus time. Great question. Gotcha. Yeah, no. All right. All right, so we've talked a lot about in the last few classes. Well, in the first class, when I talked about engine operation and theory, I talked a lot about torque and peak torque and its relationship with cylinder fill. So essentially, again, the more cylinder fill you have, the more torque you should be generating, and that's really the gist of it, really. So there's really not a whole lot else to add on that, but just bear in mind, there's one thing that I want to mention, actually. So if you look at your torque curve on the dyno graph and you see peak torque is at, let's say 5,000 RPM, and that's where we have the PowerPoint presentation coming in. So we're going to go to that PowerPoint real quick. Let's pull up our 2002 Camaro dynograph. So on this guy, let's go to full screen view. All right, so you see in this graph, again, in our VE table, we had at 4,400 RPM, 99% cylinder fill, and we also have peak torque right around 44 to 4,500 RPM or so. Actually, 4,045 holds it pretty good. So we know that's where our peak torque is at. That's where our peak cylinder fill is at. So pretty awesome. It actually correlates. Now, if we looked at this dyno graph and we look at our VE table, so I'm going to get out of full screen mode here. And let's go open our O2 Camaro file back up. Let's say that we didn't see our 100% cylinder fill correlate with our peak torque. Well, in that situation, then you would know that your VE table is not correct. So if your VE table is not correct, so let's say we saw peak torque at 5,600. Well, 5,600 RPM should be 100% cylinder fill or 99% cylinder fill, or just the highest number that we can make out of the whole table. And if it's not, you know that your VE table is off, which that would mean that your actual air fuel ratio is going to be off. So let's say we commanded 12.6 parts air to 1 part fuel, which is roughly 0.85, 0.84 lambda, right? And we actually did the run, and let's say we're at 13 parts air to 1 part fuel, and our number is too low, where we had peak torque on the dyno graph, we know right then and there that we're already off without even doing the calculation. So then you're going to take your actual AFR, which is 13, divided by your desired, which let's say is 12.6, and you're going to get a correction factor, which should equal about 1.03, 1.035, somewhere around there, if I remember correctly. And you would take that correction factor of 1.03 and multiply those corresponding values by that amount. Now you see that our values are in fact higher. So that's how you do that. That's kind of cool. Just wanted to share that with you guys. Let's get to this Camaro, all right? Let's close this out. Sorry, guys. A lot of talking. All right, so now we're in the 2002 Camaro. Now let's go over the steps of activating speed density one more time real quick. We're going to engine, we're going to go to airflow, we're going to go to dynamic. We're going to set our high RPM disable to 8,000. Now this has a high RPM re-enable as well, so we're going to set that to 7950, typically 50 RPMs below. And we're going to go to engine diagnostics, we're going to go to airflow, and we're going to go to mass airflow frequency fail high. Again, we're going to set that to 0 hertz. And the 2012 Camaro also has MAF frequency fail low. We're going to put that to 14,500. So we have to flip those values to make sure that the ECU knows the mass airflow sensor has failed. All right. Now go to DTC, and we're going to find PO101, PO102, and PO103. We're going to put those to mill on first air. All right, so we've done that. We're good here. And we have MAF frequency fail high at 0, MAF frequency fail low at 14,500. We can now flash the car. Right? So file, save as. PE test class 1. Okay, we're going to select do not write on the TCM. Write calibration. Good to go. disabling speed density and just running the math. So you guys may have asked earlier about disabling speed density altogether and just running off mass airflow sensor. This is definitely possible, and there is a way you can do that. If you're going to do that, you would set your high RPM disable value to 200. So basically, anything above 200 RPM, it's going to read only off the mass airflow sensor. That would basically really be the only thing you'd have to change. And then at that point, you can tune just the mass airflow because you will have to do that to calibrate the math properly. So I'll show you real fast here. Go to Engine, Airflow, Dynamic. You're going to put that to 200 and put the high RPM re-enable to 150. That's really the only thing you have to change. And at that point, it's going to be reading solely off of the mass airflow calibration table. So just word to the wise, that's how you do it. All right, so we are flashed. We're ready to go. We're on the dyno. Hit the fans for me, please. All right, so we're in the VCM scanner, and we are going to connect to the vehicle. And we are going to start scanning. You guys notice 100 kPa, key on, engine off. This is a good check to do anytime you start tuning the car to make sure you have the correct map sensor calibration data in. So if you put a 2-bar map sensor in, you have to update the calibration data. And just so you know, that's going to be under Airflow, General, and we have our map sensor linear value. This is basically a 3-bar map sensor, so it's 312 kPa, and it has an offset of negative 11.25 kPa. You can get that data off hptuners forums. Typically, you can get it from a lot of different sources online. Ask me as well. I can tell you real quick. So just word to the wise. So always make sure that you're reading the correct barometric pressure, key on, engine off. All right, let's fire up. All right. Now let it warm up a little bit. We're going to get up to about 160 degrees temperature if we can. All right, so now we're going to go to our Dyno Computer. All right, and I do have a Mustang Dyno, and we're going to do what's called a Pro test. So we're going to go to Test, Diagnostics, Pro test. So the Pro test allows us to force ourselves into one specific RPM and hold it there, and we're going to vary our throttle, which will vary our load and allow us to collect data at different data points, right? Different RPMs, same RPM, but different loads. So we're going to set our initial RPM target to 2000. Then we're going to click start test. Okay, we have drag mode enabled. Okay, hold on a second. Let me open it back up. My apologies. A little work here. Drag brake is now off. All right. Sorry about that. Go test, diagnostics, pro test. Go to engine RPM. Set that to 2000 RPM. Start test. And then once we want it to hold us at 2000 RPM, then we will need to click apply. Once we click apply, the dyno is going to hold us at 2000 RPM, and we are going to vary our load after that. So for now, we're going to go back over to the VCM scanner. Okay. I'm just going to control what I can see over here. Now, typically, you want to have the converter locked. Um, most of these cars nowadays are going to command it locked at part throttle anyway, so you don't really have to worry about it. But if you do need to, you can go to our vehicle controls and special functions, which is located right here. And you're going to go to transmission, and you can lock converter, TCC, torque converter clutch, PWM lock / unlock. All right, let's get rolling. Let me get up and put it into third gear. That's why I set the RPM up for on the dyno. So we're in manual. Second gear. There's third. I click apply. Now it should hold us. See, so now we're collecting data at higher loads, but at the same RPM, right? Pretty cool, right? So now we're going to go to 2,500 RPM. Go through here. All right. Now we're going to go to 3,000. Click apply. And we're going to stop scanning, stop test, drop to neutral. Let it come to a stop here, guys. All right. Put it back in park. Test and stop. Drag brake is off. All right, let's shut the car off. So we just did what's called a pro test. You can keep it on, Lane. You can keep it on. Yep. We just did what's called a pro test. So the Mustang Dyno software is pretty awesome because it will hold us at whatever specified RPM, just as you saw there. So now, if you are on an inertia dyno, it may be very difficult for you to get higher loads at lower RPMs, such as 2,000, like we saw here. If you need to get higher loads, you need to go to a higher gear to try to achieve that. Or if you're on the street, go to hilly areas, go to high gears, go to mountains, something like that of that nature. It just really kind of depends. But best case scenario, you do it on a load bearing dyno, such as the one that we're on right now. All right, so moving on here. Now we have our data, but we need to make sure we are on the correct scaling, for one. And two, we did have the anomaly in our VE table. So we have this data sitting here. Let's just hold this tight, and let's remember to disconnect from the vehicle. And we're going to go back to our VE. All right, so let's edit virtual VE. All right, so let's go ahead and get this guy out of here once again. All right, took care of that. Fixed. Now, let's go back to our scanner and let's note 210 kPa and 10 kPa. I had already copied this over before, but just to verify, okay, we have 15 and 210, so we're a little bit different. So let's right click, row axis, copy labels. Go to the graph section, click on graph layout, LTFT versus STFT, and let's paste in our correct data. All right, close that. And now we can know that we are collecting, or excuse me, copying the correct data with the correct scaling. So we're going to right click, left click in the top left corner of the table. Then you're going to right click, Control C, or copy if you will. Go back to the table, highlight the entire thing, right click, paste special, multiply by percent. All right, so you'll notice everywhere that we collected data, it adjusted those cells appropriately or proportionally based on the amount of percentage that we had seen that we were off. And actually, ironically enough, I had said 20% off, and we were basically 20% off everywhere at part throttle. I did not plan that. That's just how it worked out. So that's kind of cool. But so we want to clean this up a little bit because obviously we didn't collect all the data everywhere. So what I typically do is left click, go over, highlight into it, and interpolate. You'll notice how I adjusted it in the three-dimensional view. Right there, right? So basically just trying to clean it up, make sure it's somewhat smooth and progressive, right? So V table shouldn't be super jagged or hilly, if you will, because that typically means that we're compensating for some other kind of mechanical problem. That's why any car has to be mechanically sound before you go tune it on the dyno, right? Doesn't look too bad. Let's just interpolate here between horizontal bounds, right? So we're just cleaning it up, guys. All right, so, and we can keep on going up to higher RPM. Actually, I just noticed our RPM is not correct either. So scrap all that, right? Oh, let's go back here. Sorry, guys. Fix that. Right click, column maxi, copy labels. Right click, graph layout. Go to our column axis and fix that guy. There we go. Now we're looking better. All right, that's better, guys. My apologies. I forgot that we created that other table using the Camaro file. So highlight, paste special, multiply by percent. That's more like it. All right. So again, we're going to interpolate between cells that we couldn't collect data at because we collected data at 2000 and 2500. We didn't get 2200. Now, if we had more time, we were going to sit there and go through every single RPM increment. You could see that data and collect more specific data. But you have to be careful when you're doing the protest so you don't overheat the engine because it puts a lot of load on the engine in one period of time with limited airflow coming across the engine. So just bear that in mind when you guys are doing this, you know, at your shop on your dyno. So we're going to interpolate there, interpolate here. I sound like Bob Ross almost. It's pretty funny. What's that? Yeah. Right. All right. So we're just cleaning it up. I'm just going through this a little bit quicker just so you guys can see a little bit of result here. All right. I'm just basically using interpolate. That interpolate function is your friend, okay? And we can take more time, but we're going to go ahead and click calculate coefficients. All right, so when you click calculate coefficients, it's going to put the data which corresponds with the calculation best, right? So sometimes the values you input will not exactly line up with how the math needs to work. So it's going to vary those values just a little bit. All right, then we're going to copy that or Control C, go down to manifold switch closed, DOD, paste it in, calculate coefficients. We have fixed cam here, so I just do this for prosperity sakes, if you will, posterity, whatever it's called. So let's go here. All right, we've got them all the same. All right, now if you go to speed density, you'll notice the VE coefficients have changed. So go ahead and click File, Save As, VE test class 2. All right, we're going to flash it, and we're going to see what we get. Any other questions people want to cover right now while we wait for it to flash? Yeah, somebody made a good note. Yes, if you're not actually in speed density, if you forgot to go through one of those steps that I described, yeah, so the data you collect is going to be useless. And if you, because even though, like, I set up that VE graph, right, in the VCM scanner. Now, that graph is still going to populate data, even if it actually isn't in speed density. So if we forgot something and the car's still on mass airflow, it's still going to populate fuel trims based on manifold pressure and based on RPM. So just keep that in mind. So that information you're going to use will be not of any use to you if the car was actually still on mass airflow. All right. Got another question. How do you keep long-term fuel trim from affecting fueling in power enrichment mode? Maybe VE mode. Okay. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, power enrichment mode. So that's a good question. Typically, as long as you've done your job at idle and part throttle and use your LTFT plus STFT and gotten your trims as close as you absolutely can. And granted, you don't have to use fuel trims. You can use EQ ratio error if you have a wideband, well placed in 2 different widebands. Ideally, there's different ways you can do it. But point is, if your car is in closed loop and it transitions into open loop at wide open throttle, like many GMs do, if it's all, say, plus 10 long-term fuel trim at 3,000 RPM before you were wide open throttle, and you go wide open throttle, it may carry that 10% into wide open throttle. This can be very troublesome. Typically, if you've got your trims as close as possible, this will not happen. It's possible you may run into this issue, and that's a case-by-case basis, really. I mean, in extreme situations, you can shut off long-term fuel trim. I see a lot of guys do it. Not that I, think it's the best or right way to do it, but it is a way to get rid of that situation. With cars, as you start to modify them more and more and more, the closed loop can fight you in that sense sometimes. So that's a quick and dirty way to do it. But really, the right way, typically by going through and getting the trims as close to zero as possible, is going to achieve that same result. Granted, you're going to have some outliers. And in those outlier scenarios, it depends how much time you have. Sometimes you don't have any time. And I put the ball in the customer's court at that point. Say, hey, this is a problem we run into. It's going to make it basically where it's inconsistent for air fuel at wide open throttle. Are you okay with this? And if the car is heavily modified, I mean, that's just kind of goes with the nature of the beast, right? So it just really depends. But also make sure that your O2 sensors are working correctly, that you don't have any exhaust leaks in one bank or the other, because that can also cause all kinds of issues like you're describing. So there's a lot of other variables there also, like a misfire can cause it to be plus 10 or plus 20% long-term on just one bank, potentially, depending on which bank the misfire is coming from. So hopefully that helps answer your question. It's kind of difficult to answer, but that's the best way that I would approach it. All right, so we're flashed. We're ready to go. All right, so we got key on. Let's connect to vehicle. Absolutely, my pleasure. I get a little wordy sometimes. All right, so let's fire it up. All right, we're going to do another protest. Let's set up our dyno. Drag brake is off. All right, we're ready to roll. All right. right, stop scanning, put it in neutral, our drag brake on, stop test. All right, you guys may wonder, why am I stopping the test before we decel and come to idle? Well, that deceleration data is going to throw off our data. So I try to get just steady state data or steady state throttle. So when I'm doing that test, I'm keeping my throttle as steady as possible because I don't want to go into transient fueling mode. I want to keep in VE specifically, right? So just in case you're wondering. And what's really cool, now we did go to higher RPM, so disregard that data. But in the data where we had actually adjusted, we are way closer. Granted, it's still off in some spots. We have some outlier data, I call it, right here. So we might have to look at that a little bit. But it was -20. It was very green. Now we're getting into some red, some pink. Usually you want to see light green and light pink, and you usually know you're pretty darn close to where you want to be on your VE table. Now, if we were going to continue doing this, we would go through this process step time and time and time again to get our values as close to 0 as possible. Granted, that's usually not going to happen. Could it happen? I've seen some really, a lot of goose eggs on some VE graphs, don't get me wrong, but it's never going to happen all the way. All right. If it does, there might be something wrong with your scanner, but or you're the greatest tuner ever. But anyways, so that's kind of the process. So you would just continue to repeat that time and time again. If you guys have questions about that, please let me know. But now we are pretty much to the end of our episode. I know it's kind of sad. I cannot wait to see you guys again next time. And we should be covering positive displacement superchargers, which is actually what's on this car as well. So we'll talk a lot about that. But we have one more thing we need to do, and that is the moment that everybody's been waiting for, and that's our quiz. All right, so the quiz for today, the question is, what is 14.7 psi equivalent to when measured in kPa or kilopascals? Again, what is 14.7 psi when measured in kilopascals? All right. Cue Jeopardy music. All right, OODOP, you have won your MPVI2 from hptuners, loaded with 2 credits, ready to go. Be sure to send an email to marketing@hptuners.com and include your YouTube username in that email to claim your prize. Congratulations. We really appreciate you watching. And for everybody else who watched and joined in, we really appreciate you being a part of our team and being a part of our fun. And hopefully you learned a thing or two. I also learned a lot too for being on my end of the perspective. So I really enjoy this from that angle as well. So again, if you haven't subscribed to HP Tuners on YouTube, be sure to subscribe. Subscribe to my page, Alex Peitz. Also follow me on Instagram at Peitz Performance, and also obviously follow HP Tuners on Instagram. We really appreciate you guys. Until next time, stay tuned.